Have you ever felt guilty for saying no to someone you love? Have you ever stayed silent, even when you knew they were taking advantage of your goodwill just to keep the peace at home? If your answer is yes, then this story will hit you in a very personal way. Because this isn't just a story about a mother, a son, and a lawsuit. It's about courage, emotional freedom, and the fine, fragile line between love and manipulation. Janet, a widowed elderly woman, had spent her whole life giving. She raised her son almost entirely on her own, paid for his education, endured his adult tantrums, and looked the other way far too many times like so many mothers do. But one day, when the request crossed the boundary of what was reasonable, she was forced to choose: sign her house into a mortgage or sign her emotional death sentence. She chose to say no. And that was all it took for her to be taken to court. Ingratitude, financial abuse, emotional blackmail, and a game of self-interest where the name of justice was used as a weapon, not a protection. And the most shocking part? What happened in court? No one saw coming. Not even him. You're about to see the hidden layers of a real story that exposes just how far selfishness can go when it disguises itself as love. And how an ordinary woman found the strength to stand not only against her own son but also against guilt and fear, two of the most brutal enemies of anyone learning to finally value themselves. Get ready to dive into a journey of truths, conflicts, and turning points. And by the end, you might just see your own story reflected in every word. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find the strength to say no too. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, one of those calm silences that hint the weekend is near. Janet was brewing her usual chamomile tea, the same ritual she'd kept since Harold passed away. Simple routines like this brought her a sense of stability. But that afternoon, her peace was broken by a persistent knock at the door. When she opened it, there stood Bruce and Karen, the couple she hadn't seen in weeks. Forced smiles, nervous eyes, and a paper bag filled with artisanal bread, as if carbs could soften what was coming. Something felt off. A mother's intuition rarely lies. This wasn't just a friendly visit. Bruce started the conversation with vague phrases, trying to mask the real reason they'd come. He talked about family, about opportunities, about building something together. Janet listened, but a knot began to tighten in her stomach with every word. And then came the request. "Mom, we need your help signing a loan. Just as a co-signer. It's for a house in Malibu. We got an amazing deal, but the bank needs collateral." Janet froze. $550,000. A mortgage. His voice projected confidence, but his eyes were asking for something deeper: submission. As if saying no wasn't even an option. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The air grew heavier. Karen jumped in with her rehearsed line about how it was an investment for the family, and how Janet deserved a nicer place to visit her grandkids. The emotional appeal was blatant. Bruce, meanwhile, chose his words with surgical precision. Everything was strategically planned. But behind the polished phrases and sweet tone was manipulation. A calculated attempt to use a mother's love as leverage. Janet felt cornered, as if saying no would make her the villain. Doubt crept in quietly. She looked at Bruce and saw the little boy who once held her hand on his first day of school. But she also saw a grown man who was slowly revealing himself to be a self-serving son. This wasn't about family. This was about convenience. Bruce knew that without his mother's signature, his Malibu dream would crumble. And he had no problem turning her love into currency. Karen, too, layered on the guilt with careful subtlety, implying that refusing them meant abandoning her grandchildren. The cruelty was hidden in the softness of their tone. Silently, Janet stood up, took her teacup, and walked to the kitchen. She needed to breathe. Each step was an internal battle. She thought of Harold, how hard he worked to keep this house. How he always said, "Freedom is when no one can pressure you into signing what your heart doesn't believe in." Those words echoed in her mind. She knew that signing that loan could cost her entire retirement. Her peace. But she also knew that refusing it might cost her her relationship with her son. And for a mother who's loved too much, the fear of losing her family is often the deepest wound. When she returned to the living room, Bruce had already opened his laptop, contract displayed. "It's all ready, Mom. You just have to click here." As if it were a grocery list. As if mortgaging her future was just another favor. Janet felt the pressure rise. The document spoke of rates, fluctuating interest, legal terms she didn't fully understand. And there it was, right at the Topher name, waiting for a signature. One click. That's all it would take. But what they were asking for wasn't just a click. It was a door flung wide open, no return. A surrender in disguise. A prison wrapped in the promise of opportunity. The tension hit its peak when Janet whispered that she needed time to think. Bruce's expression changed immediately. "Think about what, Mom? Don't you trust us?" It hit her like a punch. This wasn't about trust. It was about financial abuse, neatly dressed in affection. Karen had already buried her face in her phone, pretending not to care. Janet could feel the injustice dripping down the walls of her own living room. It was like every ounce of love she had poured into raising her son was now coming back as a bill, and a heavy one. Right there, in that moment, something shifted. And it wasn't just the proposal. It was the way he looked at her. But Janet still didn't have an answer. All she knew was that this sweet-sounding offer carried a deep emotional debt. Bruce and Karen were ready to use every weapon they had to convince her. What began as a visit with the scent of fresh-baked bread now left a bitter taste in her mouth, a mixture of suspicion, hurt, and something even worse, the dawning realization that their bond was being tested. The request was about more than money. It was a crossroads. And deep down, she knew one hasty decision could cost her more than her home. It could cost her freedom. That night, Janet couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, but inside her, the noise was deafening. Memories came in waves. She saw herself younger, hand-washing laundry while Bruce played in the yard. She remembered Harold's grease-stained smile as he walked in from a double shift, whispering, "One day this will all be worth it." And it was. They built a home. They raised a good boy. At least that's what she had believed for years. Now, the question that hurt the most wasn't, "Can I trust him?" It was, "Where did I go wrong?" The unjustified mother was beginning to awaken. The one who gave everything and was now being billed instead of thanked. The image of Bruce asking for her signature ticked in her mind like a broken clock. "It's just paperwork," he had said. "Just a little favor." But Janet knew it was never just anything. It was a web spun from her kindness. The kind of manipulation that wears a smile and calls itself love but cuts like a blade. Just the thought of saying no made her chest tighten. Not because of the money, but because of the fear of losing him. Of being labeled selfish. The battle wasn't legal, it was emotional. How do you say enough to someone you raised? How do you protect your peace without looking ungrateful? She returned to her old photo albums. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, handwritten school notes with "I love you, Mom." It was all real. It happened. But the boy in those pictures didn't seem to be the same man who had just handed her a mortgage contract. And maybe that was the hardest kind of grief to bear, mourning someone who was still alive. Accepting that the child you raised with so much love had grown into an adult willing to put his comfort above his mother's well-being. Her heart still wanted to believe something could be salvaged. But reality was pointing in a different direction. She remembered old conversations with Harold about what it really meant to be family. He used to say that loving someone meant protecting them even if it meant telling them no. She wanted to believe that. But at the same time, her maternal instinct screamed at her to keep Bruce close. Even if it meant losing herself in the process. It was a brutal dilemma. Save the relationship or save her dignity. That signature wasn't just a name on a contract. It was the symbol of everything she was being asked to endure or refuse to endure any longer. The feeling of being trapped between a rock and a hard place was very real. And the worst part? She was completely alone in it. There was no one to share the weight of that decision. Her friends had already warned her about the signs of financial abuse. But she had always defended Bruce. Always. Now, she stood face-to-face with a reality that required more than common sense. It required something deeper. Courage. The kind of courage it takes to choose yourself. Even if it means breaking ties. Even if it means walking into the storm without guarantees. Even if it means refusing to carry a guilt that was never yours to begin with. Janet knew now real love doesn't ask you to destroy yourself in its name. That's a hard truth to swallow. Especially for someone raised to believe that a mother should always give even if it costs her everything. The next morning, as she poured her coffee, something small but powerful happened. She reached for her favorite mug, the one that read, "This Mama Don't Play." And for the first time in years, she didn't read it as a joke. She read it as a message. A mantra. A warning. Maybe it was finally time to become that woman. The one who doesn't bend to emotional blackmail. The one who doesn't trade self-respect for family approval. The one who says, "I love you, but I love myself too." But how do you get there? Where do you even start? The question was no longer whether Bruce was right, she knew he wasn't. The real question was whether she had the strength to deal with the fallout. What if he never came back? What if Karen cut off her grandkids? Those were real fears. Painful ones. But Janet was starting to realize something important. Maybe living in fear was worse than living with absence. Because fear paralyzes. Absence doesn't. Absence teaches you how to remember without losing yourself. And maybe, just maybe, freedom could be found even after losing everything. In that moment, something inside her began to shift. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't a final decision. Not yet. But it was the birth of a new thought. What if protecting my integrity is the greatest act of love I can offer even to him? Janet knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be tears. Closed doors. Long silences that echo louder than screams. But she also knew no peace would ever come from a forced signature. That long night, filled with memories and hesitation, quietly marked the beginning of something. A new chapter. And deep down she could feel it. The woman who would emerge from all this would not be the same. By the end of that week, Janet decided to go for a walk. No destination. Just a need to breathe. Her mind still buzzed with the memory of Bruce and Karen's visit. As she walked along her neighborhood sidewalk, she spotted Linda sweeping her porch just like she did every morning since retirement. Their eyes met. There was no need for words, just a quiet look between two women who had shared years of unspoken understanding. "Good morning, dear. You look like the world's on your shoulders." It was true. And maybe this was the moment to stop pretending everything was okay. Without overthinking, Janet stepped through the gate and sat in the chair beside her old friend. Linda had always been direct but kind. The type who never romanticized life, but also never let anyone sink alone. Janet began to tell her everything. The request. The pressure. The mortgage. The guilt. The impossible decision. And when she finished, she braced herself for the usual. "He's your son. You have to help him." But that's not what came. What came was something entirely different. Janet, sometimes loving someone means closing the door before they burn the whole house down with you inside. Those words hit deep. For the first time, someone said out loud what she had only been whispering in her own mind. Linda had a story of her own. 2 sons. One of them had once tried to drain her entire retirement savings to fund a failing business. "If I had said yes," she said quietly, "I'd be living in a basement right now, ashamed to even look at myself in the mirror." Janet listened in shock. She had never known her friend had gone through something so similar. Their bond deepened instantly. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were survivors. Survivors of a silent pattern no one teaches you how to confront. Mothers who are punished for choosing their own dignity. Linda spoke with a mix of firmness and tenderness. It wasn't advice. It was something deeper. almost like a whispered kind of freedom. "Did you know there's a thin line between love and obligation?" she asked. "And that when love becomes debt it stops being love?" Her questions were like mirrors. Janet saw herself in every one of them. She remembered all the times she had swallowed tears just to keep the family functioning. All the times she erased herself in the name of peace. And now sitting there, beside Linda, she realized something heartbreaking. The peace she fought so hard to keep was a lie. A silent contract where only she paid the price. Linda wasn't done. They're grown, Janet. Adults. And adults who use affection as a weapon need boundaries. Fast. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a wake-up call. A declaration of emotional sovereignty. The conversation went on for hours. Between shared memories and refilled teacups, something shifted inside Janet. What Linda offered wasn't just comfort. It was clarity. For the first time in a long while, Janet felt seen. Understood. Not judged. Just held. And that made all the difference. Linda spoke of freedom not as some distant, poetic dream, but as a real choice. A decision. One that begins with small, simple actions. Like saying no and meaning it. Janet listened with quiet intensity. What she felt wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was relief. A strange, aching kind of relief. The kind that comes when you finally start to heal after carrying invisible wounds for too long. As they said goodbye, Linda handed her an envelope. Inside was an old newspaper clipping. An article about a group of elderly women who had created a support network for other victims of financial abuse. "If you ever decide you need help," Linda said, "they're out there." Janet held the paper like someone grabbing a rope in the middle of a shipwreck. She still didn't know what she was going to do. But for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. And that made all the difference. It was as if somewhere in the fog, a new horizon had begun to form. Distant, yes. Still unclear. But real. That day, Janet walked back home feeling lighter. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because now, she saw it through a different lens. What had once felt impossible, now felt just difficult. And that difference meant everything. Difficult you can face. Impossible keeps you stuck. Her conversation with Linda had planted a seed of resistance. And like every good seed, it needed time, space, and courage to grow. Janet still didn't have all the answers. But she was beginning to understand something crucial. She didn't need to. All she needed to do was take the first step. And the first step was to stop blaming herself. That night, standing quietly by the window, she repeated Linda's words in her mind. Boundaries are also a form of love. They echoed inside her. She knew, deep down, that she couldn't keep pretending not to see what was happening. A mother's love can't be a blank check. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to sign her own freedom instead. In the stillness of her living room, something inside her began to solidify. The doubt was still there. But something stronger had emerged. A growing desire to protect what was sacred. And at that moment, she knew. What was sacred was herself. A few days after her conversation with Linda, Janet was still trying to process everything. Her friend's words had ignited something inside her. But fear still walked hand in hand with reason. And then the unexpected happened. Her phone rang. The name on the screen made her freeze. Barbara. Bruce's ex-girlfriend Somione, she hadn't seen or heard from in years. The voice on the other end was hesitant, but determined. "Janet, do you have a minute? I think there's something you really need to know." It caught Janet completely off guard. Barbara had always been kind, respectful. But her breakup with Bruce hadn't been exactly graceful. This call felt like a storm about to hit an already fragile house. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe just a few blocks away. As soon as they sat down, Barbara got straight to the point. Bruce didn't get approved for the loan. The bank rejected him. He didn't tell you. Janet sat frozen. Her mind struggled to make sense of the words. He's also deep in credit card debt. Old loans. And he already put down a $50,000 deposit on the house without any guarantee of approval. With every sentence, the floor beneath Janet seemed to crack. The son who asked for her signature as if it were a simple gesture of support had already made a reckless financial commitment without telling her. And now, he was trying to drag her into it. Barbara placed a folder on the table. Screenshots, statements, bank records. There was no denying it. Bruce had lied. And not a harmless little lie. Not a white lie told to avoid drama. But a calculated web of manipulation. Designed to corner Janet emotionally. What she once believed was a family favor was now revealing itself as a much darker game. Janet's heart pounded. A mix of disbelief, sadness, and something heavier. A betrayal too deep to name. He told me he'd already convinced you. Barbara's voice was steady, but the words hit like a punch to the gut. He said it was only a matter of time before you signed. Janet felt herself shrinking like a piece in someone else's game. Like a pawn being moved without her consent. What else had Bruce said about her behind her back? How many times had he seen her not as a mother, but as a solution? That moment stirred something inside her. Something that had been asleep for years. Anger. Not the kind that clouds judgment, but the kind that clears everything. A fierce, sharp, clear-sighted anger. The kind that turns sorrow into strength. Janet was finally seeing Bruce for who he truly was. Not the little boy frozen in family photos. But a grown man willing to put his own mother at risk for his own comfort. In the middle of their conversation, Barbara made a quiet confession. He's always known how to make people feel guilty for not doing what he wants. A manipulative charm. A son who had mastered the art of emotional blackmail. Even with the people who loved him unconditionally. Janet sat in silence as the puzzle pieces rearranged themselves in her mind. The times Bruce cried when he asked for money. The long silences when she dared to say no. The sudden, convenient visits that always came with a request. It all made sense now. The mask was slipping. And the truth, as painful as it was also liberating. As they got up to leave, Barbara gently took Janet's hand. I know it's hard to see this in your own child. But you can still walk away from this with your dignity intact. Those words stuck to her ribs. Clung to her spine. They didn't come from judgment. They came from survival. Janet walked home with her mind spinning. She couldn't stop thinking about the $50,000 deposit. Bruce had already committed, even without her. Had gambled assuming her guilt would close the deal. Now that she knew, she felt a new kind of pressure. One that whispered, "You are the last line of defense between him and a disaster of his own making." That night, Janet laid out all the documents Barbara had given her across the kitchen table. She read each one line by line. This wasn't about opinion anymore. This was fact. Black and white. Undeniable. Bruce had lied. He had hidden the truth. And worst of all, had weaponized the sacred bond between mother and son. That request she once thought was a gesture of closeness was in fact a trap. A calculated setup. Disguised as affection. The truth didn't just hurt. It demanded action. And Janet could no longer look away from what was right in front of her. Something inside her broke. But not in the way it used to. This wasn't fragility. It was the sound of naivete snapping in half. The woman who had spent a lifetime believing in unconditional love was now beginning to understand that even love needs limits. She still didn't know exactly what her next steps would be, but one thing was becoming crystal clear. She would not sign. Not out of spite. Not out of revenge. But out of something far more powerful. Emotional justice. For the first time, Janet didn't feel like a wronged mother. She felt like a woman waking up. And with that awakening, Guilt finally began to give way to courage. What would come next was still uncertain. But one thing was no longer in doubt. She would never again be manipulated. The next morning, Janet woke up with a different kind of weight in her chest. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was resolve. She brewed her coffee, turned on her favorite jazz playlist, and looked around her home like someone reclaiming their territory. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think clearly. This wasn't a cry for help. This wasn't family bonding. This was financial abuse, wrapped in the illusion of love. And she was at the center of it. Her first step was simple, but deeply symbolic. She picked up the phone, called a locksmith, and had every lock in the house changed. It wasn't just about physical security. It was a declaration, a boundary made real, a quiet but firm line between her and the chaos. Next, she went to her bank. She took the folder Barbara had given her and laid everything out for the branch manager. She spoke calmly but with purpose, with clarity, with authority. At first, he looked skeptical. But the more he read, the more his expression changed. And then he said something she would never forget. "You were absolutely right not to sign." It landed like a balm on an open wound. Finally someone saw it. Finally someone said it. Janet then scheduled a meeting with an attorney who specialized in elder financial protection. She wasn't sure what Bruce might do next. But she needed to be ready. Because what was at stake now wasn't just her money. It was her dignity. Back at home, Janet began securing every part of her life. She organized her documents, updated her banking passwords, changed every digital access point that Bruce might still know. Nothing would be left vulnerable. He had already shown her what he was capable of. And Janet refused to be caught off guard ever again. She also called her insurance company and updated her list of beneficiaries. For decades, she had lived for others. Now, she was learning how to live for herself. And for a woman who had grown up being told that a mother's role is to sacrifice, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Each change she made, each password reset, each folder reorganized, was an act of defiance against a culture that normalizes the exploitation of older women. In the days that followed, Janet kept her distance from Bruce and Karen. She ignored calls, let messages pile up, blocked the guilt before it could get in. She needed space. And surprisingly, their absence brought a strange kind of peace. It was the silence of self-respect. No more walking on eggshells. No more second-guessing. No more trying to please everyone just to avoid conflict. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was in control of her own life. And she liked it. More than she expected. The submissive woman who once trembled at the word no was slowly being replaced by someone who knew how to say it without shame, without apology. And that was freedom. One afternoon, while organizing an old drawer, Janet found a letter from Harold. It was tucked between old birthday cards and forgotten receipts. A handwritten note, yellowed with time. He had written it years ago, during one of the hardest financial moments they had ever faced together. His words were simple, but they struck deep. There is no price worth paying if it costs you your peace. Freedom is worth more than any temporary comfort. Janet read it as if he were right there beside her. As if Harold had reached through time to whisper exactly what she needed to hear. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a blessing, like a sign. He had always been her compass. And now, even from beyond, he was still pointing her in the right direction. She folded the letter slowly, held it against her chest, and closed her eyes. A quiet smile rose to her lips. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was her anchor, her permission, her confirmation. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't overreacting. She wasn't selfish. She was simply doing what Harold would have wanted all along, protecting herself. And that truth gave her exactly what she needed, the strength to keep going. By the end of that week, Janet stood in front of the mirror with different eyes. Her face still carried the soft marks of time, but now, they blended with something stronger. Clarity, conviction, peace, power. Her awakening hadn't come through rage or rebellion. It came through small, deliberate choices, stacked like bricks, each one laid with quiet resolve. She realized that protecting her integrity was not only an act of survival, it was an act of love. Love for Harold's memory. Love for the life they built together. Love for the woman she had buried beneath years of sacrifice. Because a mother who is emotionally broken can't hold up anyone. Not truly. Not for long. And there, in that mirror, she didn't see a tired old woman. She saw someone whole. Someone awake. Someone willing to fight for what was hers. And that was more valuable than any mansion in Malibu. Finally, she sat down in her living room, cupped her hands around a warm mug of tea, and exhaled slowly. She didn't know what Bruce would do next. Maybe he'd push harder. Maybe he'd disappear. But strangely none of it mattered quite as much now. What mattered was something else entirely. For the first time, she was ready. Not just ready to say no, but ready to hold it, defend it, stand in it. And for someone who had spent a lifetime being judged, for loving too much, for giving too freely, for always saying yes, that no was the loudest, clearest, most powerful truth she had ever spoken. Janet had awakened. And once a woman awakens, there's no going back. The silence between Janet and Bruce lasted nearly a week until he showed up, unannounced. He rang the doorbell like someone who still believed a smile and a simple mom could undo everything. Janet opened the door but didn't step aside. Her gaze was steady, posture upright. Bruce smiled the same smile he had used since childhood when he wanted something. "Mom, we need to talk." She took a deep breath and allowed him inside, but with one condition: no lies this time. He hesitated. And in that brief second, Janet already knew he had come back with the same old strategy. Bruce sat on the couch, adjusted his blazer, and began, "I know you're upset. But this is all just a misunderstanding. I would never put you at risk." Janet interrupted him calmly, "You already did." The words hung in the air. He wasn't expecting resistance. He expected the mother he always knew, gentle, guilty, willing to give in. But the woman in front of him now was different. Bruce tried to appeal to her emotions, spoke of the grandchildren, the family, the Malibu house that was supposed to be for everyone. He used phrases like "do it for us" and "don't be so harsh." It was manipulation in its purest form. Janet listened, but she wasn't moved. Every word he said echoed a pattern she was finally starting to see. "You asked me to co-sign a $500,000 loan without telling me the bank had already denied it. You hid your debt. That's not love, Bruce. That's emotional blackmail." He was speechless for a moment. And then the mask dropped. His voice rose. The tone shifted. "You're selfish, Mom. You always have been. Now that I really need you, you're turning your back on me? Fine. But don't expect the boys to come visit you at Christmas." It was cruel. Janet felt the blow. Using her grandsons as bargaining chips was low even for Bruce. But instead of retreating, she stood her ground. "If being selfish means protecting my home and my peace, then maybe I'm learning to be selfish for the first time." Her response was firm, but not angry. It was a declaration of independence. Bruce still tried to guilt her, bringing up the past. "How old was I when Harold died? Who took care of me? Who sacrificed everything?" Janet gave a sad smile. "And I did it because I love you. Not to become a hostage to your eternal gratitude." The tension in the room was thick. Karen, waiting in the car, kept texting to see if he had convinced her yet. Janet saw the screen light up. Saw everything. And that only confirmed there was no going back. Bruce wasn't there out of love. He was there out of interest. She stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. You know where the exit is. He got up slowly, furious. So that's it? After everything, you're really going to do this to me? Janet answered with steady resolve. I'm not doing anything to you. I'm finally doing something for me. That sentence marked the end of an era. Bruce stormed out, slamming the gate. Janet stood still, heart pounding. Did she cry? Yes. But it wasn't the cry of guilt. It was the cry of liberation. The kind of tear that falls when you finally choose yourself after a lifetime of choosing others. In that room, there was no more space for guilt or submission. The son she raised had become a man who couldn't hear the word no. And now, he would have to deal with that. Janet knew the pain of that moment would be deep. But she also knew the pain of continuing to erase herself would be even worse. In the days that followed, came the long messages, the attempts to reverse the situation. Bruce alternated between apologies and new accusations. You have no heart. You're alone because you chose to be. But none of it worked. Janet had already made her choice. And there was no more room for speeches that disguised affection as obligation. She now understood that emotional freedom is the ability to hear those attacks and still not bow down. It was a new kind of peace. Silent. But firm. The kind of peace that comes when you stop trying to fix something that only works if you stay broken. What was most surprising was that with distance, life regained its color. Janet started walking more, chatting with neighbors, even picked up an old painting hobby. She discovered there was life beyond being a mother at any cost. That there was an identity beyond endless sacrifice. And in this new world, she felt light. Not because she lost her son, but because she found herself. And finding herself, after so long, was a gift she wouldn't trade for even 1,000 grandkids at Christmas. Bruce had confronted her. But the one truly transformed by that meeting was her. It was on a gray Tuesday morning that the envelope arrived. Janet thought it was ordinary mail, maybe something from the bank or the neighborhood association. But when she opened it, the shock hit hard. Bruce had filed a lawsuit. He was demanding the $550,000 that, according to him, she had verbally promised to co-sign. It was surreal. The son she raised with so much love was now accusing her of breaking a promise. Janet sat down, breath short, hands trembling. For a moment, she felt the urge to doubt herself. But it didn't last long. She knew there had never been a promise. Only manipulation. And now it was all going public. She immediately reached out to the lawyer she had already spoken to. He read the document carefully and let out a long sigh. This lawsuit is a bluff. But we'll still need to take it seriously. Janet nodded. She knew being right wasn't enough, she had to prove it. So they began gathering everything: conversations, witnesses, documents, evidence of coercion. The most important thing was to show that Bruce's proposal had always been abusive, dishonest, and emotionally manipulative. A clear case of attempted financial abuse against a senior. And thankfully, that was starting to carry weight in court. Linda, the neighbor, was one of the first to volunteer as a witness. She said she had overheard part of the conversation on the porch and clearly saw how Bruce tried to pressure his mother. I've never heard your voice shake like that, she said, eyes welling up. You were scared, Janet. And no one has the right to make a mother feel that in her own home. That hit deep. Because it was true. And now, Linda didn't just validate the feeling, she stood beside her. Strongly. Other neighbors began sharing similar stories involving their children or grandchildren. Janet no longer felt like an isolated case. Barbara, Bruce's ex-girlfriend, also stepped up. She showed up at the lawyer's office and handed over all the screenshots, messages, and documents she had saved. Including an email where Bruce wrote, "My mom will sign, don't worry. She always gives in eventually." That was gold. With that material, the entire narrative shifted. Janet wasn't a mother who broke a promise, she was a woman emotionally pressured by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The lawyer built the defense with precision. It was clear this lawsuit was a desperate attempt to extort money by force. The hearing was scheduled for 3 months later, enough time for Janet to prepare. During that period, she attended support groups for elderly victims of financial abuse. There, she met other women with stories as painful, more painful than her own. And with every meeting, her strength grew. She began to see this case not just as a personal battle, but as something bigger. How many mothers had been threatened, pressured, or manipulated by their own children? And how many kept quiet out of fear, shame, or loneliness? Janet made a decision: she wouldn't be one of them anymore. When the day of the hearing arrived, she was ready. Simple clothes, steady posture, calm face. Bruce, on the other side of the room, looked less confident. Karen wasn't with him, she had needed to travel. Maybe even her support was starting to crack. When questioned about the alleged verbal agreement, Bruce stammered. Said his mother had always been supportive and that it was pretty much a done deal. But the judge was clear: pretty much isn't a promise. And a promise without documentation, especially for that amount, is legally weak. Janet stayed silent, but her lawyer was flawless. The evidence spoke for itself. The turning point came when Barbara handed printed documents directly to the judge. They revealed Bruce had already made deposits, committed to contracts, and kept all of it hidden from his mother. It was a clear case of bad faith. The judge's tone began to change. What we have here is an attempt to hold a senior responsible for unilateral decisions made without her consent, and worse, with emotional manipulation. Janet couldn't hold back the tears, but this time, they were tears of relief. For the first time, an authority was publicly acknowledging what she had felt all along: she was being wronged. At the end of the hearing, the judge dismissed the case and called for an investigation into possible attempted fraud. Bruce left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. His silence was the sound of defeat. Janet, surrounded by Linda, Barbara, and her lawyer, felt something new being born. It wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one marked by respect, dignity, and a sense of emotional justice she never imagined she'd experience. The woman who once feared saying no was now being listened to with respect by an entire courtroom. And that was the greatest victory. The silence in the courtroom was almost ceremonial when the judge brought down the gavel and announced his decision: this case is dismissed due to lack of evidence and clear indications of bad faith by the plaintiff. It was the official end of Bruce's attempt. Janet closed her eyes for a second, not to savor revenge, but to breathe in relief. It felt like a ton of guilt, fear, and insecurity had been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time, she wasn't just the wronged mother, she was the woman who had won. She had defeated fear, manipulation, and the twisted logic of conditional love. Bruce didn't stay to hear the rest. He left the room quickly, not looking back. Karen, as expected, wasn't by his side. Rumor had it she had ended things days before the hearing. She had said she wasn't willing to be with someone who manipulates his own mother. And the truth is, after the scandal, many began to distance themselves from Bruce. Old friends, co-workers, even neighbors started seeing him differently. The label of a self-serving son stuck to him with force. The reputation he had tried so hard to preserve collapsed. Janet, on the other hand, saw doors opening. She was invited to speak at community centers, asked to participate in awareness campaigns on financial abuse among the elderly, and sought out by other women who wanted to learn how to protect themselves emotionally and legally. The woman who once feared raising her voice now spoke confidently to entire auditoriums. Her courage had become an example. And every time she told her story, she made one thing clear: emotional justice is a right, not a favor. The most symbolic moment came when Janet decided what to do with the symbolic compensation the court ordered Bruce to pay for emotional damages and legal fees. She created an educational fund in Harold's name, aimed at helping young people who care for their grandparents. It's not about the money. It's about turning pain into purpose. That phrase was printed on the homepage of the project. The fund started small, but, with community support and help from a local outreach center, it grew rapidly. And with that, Harold's name lived on it as a symbol of debt, but as a symbol of care. At home, things changed too. Janet redecorated the living room, swapped out old curtains, gave the porch a fresh look. It wasn't just an aesthetic renovation. It was an inner rebuilding reflected in the details. The woman who spent years afraid of upsetting her son was now living to please herself. She went back to painting, reconnected with old friends, and even started attending senior dance classes. It wasn't about getting over Bruce. It was about remembering who she was before she lived only for him. And that reconnection with herself, that was the ultimate freedom. In one of her painting classes, she created a piece showing a half-open door with light pouring through. When asked about its meaning, she replied, "That's me. A woman who chose to open the door for herself." Simple, yet it said everything. The woman who once accepted scraps of attention now chose who could enter her time, her home, her energy. Bruce still sent messages few and far between, but Janet didn't respond. Not out of anger, but because she had come to understand that some reconciliations are only possible after true remorse, not fragile justifications. The neighborhood began to see her differently. The same neighbors who once thought it was normal for her to give in to everything now spoke with admiration about her stance. "Janet is an inspiration," they said. But she wasn't looking for applause. What she wanted and had finally earned was respect. And that respect began the moment she decided to respect herself. The wounds still existed, of course. But now they came with firm scars. Marks of a war she won not with brute force, but with emotional intelligence, patience, and strength. The external battle was over. And she was alive and whole. In the end, Janet realized that the story had never really been about money. It was about boundaries, self-love, and the courage to rewrite her own story. Every woman who heard her speak felt less alone. And maybe that was the greatest victory. More than winning in court, Janet had won in life. And as she often repeated, family is important. But no family is worth more than my peace. That was her new philosophy. And with it, a new woman had emerged. In the months that followed the end of the trial, Janet entered a new chapter of her life. A chapter without guilt, without fear, without forced concessions. She rediscovered the value of tranquility and the beauty of a simple routine. She started waking up earlier, not out of obligation, but out of joy. She walked through the neighborhood, greeted neighbors, fed the birds in the park. Small rituals that once seemed invisible now sparkled with new meaning. The freedom she had gained didn't come with fanfare. It came with silence, with conscious choices. And that made it even more powerful. Janet, the wronged mother, was now a whole woman. And that changed everything. One of the first major projects she embraced was the educational fund created in Harold's memory. She named the program Roots Wings. Roots to remind us who we are. Wings to go beyond what others expect of us. That was the spirit. With the help of volunteers, she began mentoring young people who lived with grandparents or elderly caregivers. The idea was to offer not just scholarships, but emotional support. Janet no longer used her experience as a wound, but as a tool for transformation. She used to say, "Pain needs a destination, otherwise, it rots inside us." With each meeting at the project, Janet felt a new energy. It wasn't the emotional exhaustion from years of trying to save Bruce from himself. It was lightness. It was connection. It was genuine exchange. And the more she engaged with the initiative, the more she realized how far she had drifted from her own essence over the years. Before, she had been just Bruce's mom. Now, she was Janet. A woman with a voice, a story, a purpose. A woman who said no with conviction and yes with intention. And that reconstruction didn't need an audience. It only needed her own recognition of her worth. With time, Janet also began helping other elderly women in the area. She created a small group called Steel and Petal Women, a community for women who had suffered financial or emotional abuse. There, they shared stories, exchanged advice, cried, laughed. It was a space for healing. A place where no one had to justify choosing their own peace. Janet would always say, no one owes you suffering just because you love them. And that became almost a mantra among them. With each meeting, a new layer of courage was born. And Janet became a guide without even realizing it. In her personal life, the rebuilding was even more quiet. She allowed herself to rest without guilt, to cook just for herself with care, to buy flowers for no reason at all. Small joys that rekindled the pleasure of simply being alive. She had friends over more often now. They laughed, shared stories, even organized themed dinners just for fun. Janet wore lipstick again. She looked at herself in the mirror with affection. Slowly, the woman who had silenced herself for so long was putting the pieces back together. And the best part, she no longer had anything to prove to anyone. Living well had become her new act of resistance. Bruce? He tried to reconnect. Sent a message now and then, always vague. Janet read them, but didn't reply. She knew there was still a lot to rebuild between them, if that was even possible. She forgave him, yes. But to let everything go back to the way it was? Never. She had learned through pain and courage that forgiveness isn't an invitation to reopen doors. It's a gift you give yourself. And sometimes, that means walking separate paths. Her motherly love hadn't ended. But now, it was filtered through clarity. And that, in itself, was a form of emotional justice. One night, while organizing her drawers, Janet found a box filled with old letters from Bruce written when he was just a child. She read a few, cried, smiled. The pain was still there, but now it came with acceptance. She understood that, despite everything, there had been love in the past. But love without boundaries becomes a prison. And she wasn't born to live behind bars. She put the letters away with care, without clinging to the past. They were part of her story. But they would no longer dictate her future. Janet was no longer the same. And that was beautiful to witness even for her. Deep down, Janet knew her story was still rare, but it shouldn't be. She wanted other women, mothers or not, to know it was possible to rebuild your life after being hurt by someone you love. That peace can be found even after emotional storms. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's a decision. And so, piece by piece, Janet became not just an example, but a source of hope. She wasn't seeking applause. She wanted resonance. And every time someone said, "You inspired me," she smiled quietly, knowing it had all been worth it. It was on a Sunday morning that the letter arrived. Handwritten, with her name carefully written on the envelope. The sender, Bruce. The son who hadn't spoken to her in months. Janet stood there, holding the envelope, staring at it like a mirror she could no longer avoid. Her heart raced, but she took a deep breath. There was no rush. She brought the letter into the living room, made herself a cup of tea, sat in her favorite armchair, and only then began to read. The words, though trying to sound strong, were soaked in regret. Bruce wrote that he didn't know how to fix things. That maybe he didn't even deserve forgiveness. He admitted he had been driven by fear of failure, by pride, by the assumption that his mother would always be there to cushion every fall. He said he felt ashamed, that he had realized too late the value of what he had lost. The letter didn't ask for money, nor help. It simply said, "I'm sorry. Truly." Janet read every word carefully, without skipping a line. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just felt. And that feeling was deep, serene, and final. She understood. But understanding wasn't the same as going back. When she finished reading, she folded the letter gently, put it back in the envelope, and tucked it away in her dresser drawer. She didn't respond. Not out of lack of love, but out of deep self-respect. Janet knew some wounds heal better in silence. And sometimes, the greatest answer is no new beginning. Bruce might have needed forgiveness. But Janet needed freedom. And that, now, was non-negotiable. It wasn't bitterness. It was maturity. It was the woman who had found herself saying, "I no longer need to hurt myself to keep anyone around." That afternoon, she went out to the garden and watered her flowers, just like always. She looked up at the sky, felt the wind on her face, and reflected on how much she had changed. Years ago, that same letter would have made her drop everything and run to embrace her son. Today, she knew that love must have roots but also boundaries. That protecting what is sacred sometimes means saying goodbye to those who keep crossing the line. Love cannot come with hidden clauses. And Janet, with all the love in the world, chose to let go. She chose peace. And that choice was her greatest inheritance. That night, she picked up a notebook and wrote a single sentence. Not for Bruce but for herself. A reminder. A manifesto. A silent prayer that summed up everything she had learned. Peace is not about keeping the family together at any cost. Peace is about protecting what is sacred even if it means letting go. She read it softly, closed the notebook, turned off the light, and went to sleep. Not as someone running from pain but as someone finally resting in truth. This story doesn't end with forced reconciliations or artificial happy endings. It ends exactly where it should, at the point where Janet realized that the greatest justice is emotional. That love without respect is a prison. That the most beautiful kind of courage is choosing yourself. And that even in the face of ingratitude, it is still possible to live with lightness. Janet moved on with her life, not perfect, but full. And every day, as she opened her window, she remembered it is possible to start over after being hurt. As long as the healing begins from the inside out. And now I ask you, how many times have you sacrificed your peace just to keep someone close? How often have you silenced your intuition in the name of a love that only gave you guilt in return? Janet's story is powerful, but it's not unique. All of us, at some point in life, have said yes when we should have said no. Out of fear. Out of love. Out of habit. But what if today is the day to change that? What if real courage is setting boundaries even when it hurts? What if protecting your emotional freedom is the most important step you haven't taken yet? This story isn't just about a legal fight. It's about reclaiming your voice. Rebuilding your worth. And understanding that self-respect is not a luxury, it's a foundation. And when the foundation is solid, nothing can shake you. So before you leave this video, I invite you to reflect. What emotional mortgage have you been carrying? What signatures have you given without even noticing? And most of all, what are you willing to let go of to finally live in peace? If this story touched you in any way, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Here, we talk about fresh starts, about courage, about real life, and you're a part of it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any content, and of course, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in Janet's place?